All right, you guys, in this section, we're going to be solving quadratic equations using completing the square. Okay, so before we jump into some example problems, let's walk ourselves through the steps. So if you're going to be using completing the square, okay, this is one of the methods that always works. Okay, so previously we talked about factoring. We also talked about the square root method. Even though those methods are super convenient, they don't always work. So this is the first method that we're going to learn that will work with no matter what quadratic equation you have. Okay, the only downside of this method is that sometimes it can be fairly tedious, but on the plus side, like I said, it always works. So step one is going to be, if a does not equal 1, you're going to divide both sides of the equation by a. So remember, a is your leading coefficient. Okay, so in order to use this method, your leading coefficient needs to be 1 before you start. Step 2 is to write the equation so that the constant term is alone on one side of the equality symbol. Step 3, you're going to square half the coefficient of x and add this square to each side of the equation. Step 4, you're going to factor the left-hand side. And step 5, you're going to use the square root property to find the solution. Okay, so I know the steps sound a little confusing, but it'll be so much clearer once we go through a problem. Okay, so let's work through our first example. Okay, so the directions say to solve using completing the square method, and we have x squared minus 2x minus 5 equals 0. So the first thing we're going to do is write our problem. Okay, so our steps told us that the first thing we need to do is make sure that our leading coefficient is 1. Okay, so as I'm looking at my x squared term, the number in front of that is 1, so I'm good. All right, step 2 is to move your constant term to the other side of the equation. So your constant term is the term that doesn't have any variables attached to it. So for us, that's the negative 5. So to move it, I'm going to add 5 to both sides of my equation. Okay, so as I move that 5 over, I'm going to put a blank on each side of my equation. Okay, so one of the key things about completing the square is that typically, even though it'll work for any problem that you've been given, usually we use it for quadratics that are not factorable, because if they factor, then we would just use the first method that we learned. So in order to create something that is factorable, our goal is to create a perfect square. And in order to create that perfect square, we're going to have to add a quantity to the left and right side of the equation. To figure out what that quantity is, you're always going to do b divided by 2 squared, okay? And b is always going to be your coefficient that's attached to your x term. So for us, that's going to be negative 2. So I'm going to say negative 2 divided by 2 squared, okay? Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. And negative 1 squared is 1. So that means I'm going to add 1 to the left-hand side of the equation and to the right-hand side. Okay? All right, now once I do that, okay, the left-hand side of my equation should be able to be factored now. And the right-hand side, we are going to combine. Okay? So when I go to factor the left-hand side, okay, the two factors that I get, they're always going to be the same. So instead of writing 2 sets of parentheses, I'm just going to write 1, and I'm going to raise it to the second power because they're going to be the same. Now, to figure out what goes in the parentheses, your variable is always going to go in the front. So our variable is x, all right? And whatever your b divided by 2 was before you squared it, that's what's going to go behind. So this is going to be b divided by 2. Well, our b divided by 2, before we squared it, was negative 1. Okay, so negative 1 goes inside of my parentheses. And then we are going to combine 5 plus 1, which is 6. Okay, now we have, let me rewrite it so it's a little clearer. We have x minus 1 squared equals 6. Okay, now based on the methods that we learned previously, okay, this is perfectly set up now to use the square root method. which means we're going to take the square root of both sides. Okay. And once we do that, on the left-hand side, we're going to be left with x minus 1. We're going to put the plus minus symbol on the right-hand side and take the square root of 6. So the square root of 6 doesn't break down and it doesn't reduce any farther, so we're going to leave it the way that it is. Okay. And then we need to solve for x. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides of my equation. So I have x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 6. And that's my answer. So remember, when we're using the shorthand, remember that's two separate answers. One is 1 plus the square root of 6, and the other one is 1 minus the square root of 6. But those are our two answers. Okay? All right, let's try another example. All right, let's look at the second one. So same directions. Solve using completing the square method. So we have x squared minus 6x minus 2 equals 0. So I'm going to write my problem first. Okay. Step 1 is to always check that your leading coefficient is 1. So as I look in front of my x squared term, the number in front of that is 1. So I'm good. Okay. Step 2 is to move your constant term to the other side of the equation. So my constant term for this problem is negative 2. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I'm going to put in my blanks. Okay. Now remember, you need to find the quantity that's going to go in both sides of the equation. Okay. So to find that quantity, you're going to do b divided by 2 squared. And b is the coefficient that sits in front of x. So b is negative 6. So I have negative 6 divided by 2. And we're going to square it. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And negative 3 squared is 9. So 9 goes in both of those parentheses. Okay. Now, since we did that, remember the left-hand side, you should be able to factor it now. And the right-hand side, you should be able to combine. Okay. When we factor the left-hand side, our variable is going to go in the front, which is x. Okay. And whatever b divided by 2 was before we squared it is going to go on the right-hand side. Okay, so b divided by 2 for us was negative 3. Okay, and then we're going to combine the right-hand side. So 2 plus 9, that's 11. Okay, so we have x minus 3 squared equals 11. All right, so now since we have that quantity squared and it equals a whole number, we can use the square root method on it. Which means we're going to take the square root of both sides. So the left-hand side is going to give me x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 11. Okay, and then we need to solve for x. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 11. And remember, that is two different answers. So one of them is 3 plus the square root of 11, and the other one is 3 minus the square root of 11. And those are my answers.